Israel says it's massing troops on the border with Gaza and calling up thousands of reservists ahead of a possible ground invasion of the Hamas-ruled territory. Overnight, the Israeli Air Force stepped up strikes on Gaza as Hamas launched hundreds of rockets far into Israel. This comes amid renewed mob violence between Arab and Jewish neighbours in Israeli cities, and the death toll in this conflict is rising.
Plumes of smoke over Gaza. On the ground, residents picked through the destruction caused by days of Israeli airstrikes. Palestinians in Gaza spent the Muslim holiday of Eid under bombardment. Here amongst the rubble, there is little to celebrate. The Israel Defense Force bombs what it says is a military compound belonging to the Palestinian militant group Hamas in Gaza. It's retaliation for rockets fired at Israel. The conflict between Israel and Hamas is escalating. The IDF has already attacked hundreds of targets, and we continue to strike Hamas whilst defending our citizens. It will take more time, but with both defending and attacking, we will restore peace to Israel. The air raid sirens sound. Yet again, Israelis run for cover. This time, Israel's aerial missile defense system intercepted a missile. But other rockets have cracked the so-called Iron Dome, and the reach of Hamas seems to be extending further and further into Israel. This is a neighborhood just 10 kilometers east of Tel Aviv, in heavily populated central Israel. As Hamas launches more rockets from Gaza, negotiators from Egypt held talks with both sides to try and find a truce. Egyptian, Qatari and international mediators are talking with the resistance Hamas and the Israeli occupation. But every time they make an effort to create a situation which allows the aggression to stop, a new Israeli decision to destroy towers and kill children, the elderly and women stifles these efforts. And in Gaza, as night falls, wary residents are fleeing their homes as a new round of shelling hits the city.
Let's bring in our Jerusalem correspondent here, Tanya Kramer. Tanya, dramatic developments there in the past 24 hours. How are things looking there this morning?
Well, absolutely. Overnight, there were massive strikes by the Israeli Air Force, the naval and artillery, mainly in the northern part of Gaza. The army says that 160 planes were involved in those strikes and bombardments. And they say the targets were mainly underground tunnels, a tunnel system that is used by Hamas and Islamic Jihad inside Gaza. Now, this has, of course, caused immense devastation and hardship for the residents in this area, which were reportedly not being warned of this bombing campaign. According to the army, again, 55 rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel overnight. There were no rockets overnight fired into central Israel. And also, in a parallel development, there were renewed violence, and also riots and protests and confrontations between far-right Jewish extremists and people from the Arab-Israeli community in those mixed towns across Israel that we've seen overnight.
Now, Israel is making no secret of the fact that it is massing troops at the Gaza border. Is a ground offensive imminent, Tanya?
Well, we know that there are preparations, and we understand from the army that plans are being drafted. But at the moment, we get a sense that the campaign is mainly focused on the Air Force, naval and artillery from outside of Gaza. There had been reports overnight based on a tweet that came out from the military spokesperson's office that had created some confusion, but the military confirmed this morning there are no ground troops in Gaza at the moment.
What about efforts to end this fighting, Tanya? How much hope is there for diplomacy here?
While on an international level, diplomacy seems to move or appears to move rather slow, we understand that now a UN Security Council meeting has been scheduled for Sunday. But I think the focus, as we also heard in the report, is on regional efforts. And in previous rounds of hostilities or during the wars, Egypt, Qatar and the United Nations have played a role in mediating between the warring factions. But we also have heard again from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night in a statement that the operation would take as long as necessary. So at the moment, we have no indication when those mediation efforts will see any results.
Tanya, thank you so much. DW's Jerusalem correspondent Tanya Kramer. Well, for more on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, let's bring in Matthias Schmaler. He's Gaza director of the UN Relief and Works Agency, responsible for the welfare of Palestine refugees. He joins us from Gaza City. Thanks for being with us. Mr. Schmaler, give us a sense of the humanitarian situation in Gaza right now.
Good morning to you, Terry, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about that. The situation is a mixture of things. There's despair. Yesterday was the first day of Eid after Ramadan, and I think people are in despair that they cannot celebrate this religious festivity that is so important. There is people terrified after 3 days and 3 nights of intense rockets from here, but intense bombarding into Gaza. People are terrified, and that's one reason why they're on the move. There's a rising human cost among the people killed. As you mentioned at the beginning, there are 8 children that went to our UNRWA UN schools. And then there's homelessness. People are on the move. We have the reports I'm getting this morning is that there are 16 schools of our schools where people are seeking shelter. In one school, more than 2,000 people. So the despair and humanitarian needs are growing.
Your agency ordered staff to stay home, I understand, from its clinics in order to keep them safe. How are you assisting civilians in this situation?
So we were able to provide primary health care through our 22 health centers on the first day. But then on the second day, my chief of health, a fantastic Palestinian doctor, Dr. Rada, she was the one who called me early in the morning and said, this is too hot, as she put it. This is too dangerous. We have to today at least keep the health centers closed. This is coming from a woman who is very proud to say in 2014 we didn't shut one day. So it gives you a sense of the seriousness. Back to your question, we've kept our sanitation services open. Yesterday, because of the Eid holiday, everything was going to stop anyway. Today we've resumed sanitation, so cleaning in the 8 camps. And tomorrow we hope that the situation will facilitate primary health care. The next big challenge is to support people in our schools who are seeking shelter. So we will do what we can to provide support, the most basic support to the internally displaced.
Gaza is under bombardment. It's in the middle of a pandemic. How are hospitals in Gaza coping at this point?
Barely is my understanding. I haven't been in the last 2-3 days for obvious reasons. The reports I'm getting is they're barely coping. Fortunately, the devastating second wave of the COVID pandemic was starting to ease off. So they were under pressure, but it was starting to be manageable. So far, my understanding is they can cope with the casualties and injured. But of course, if this continued, if there were a ground offensive, the hospitals would very, very soon reach maximum capacity, and that would be a serious humanitarian problem.
I understand that water is a concern, clean water, sanitation facilities in Gaza. There's concern about the fuel supply, electricity. What do civilians in Gaza need most at this point?
Well, to be honest, what they need most is for the fighting to stop, of course, but that's a given. What is needed most is to make sure they have their basic food needs covered. For the moment, there seems to be enough food in the markets. But, of course, if people flee their homes, as they have started doing since yesterday, and are in shelters or with relatives, food needs will increase. You mentioned water. At the best of times, there is not enough safe water supply. So water will very very quickly become a huge issue. And then let me say finally that beyond the basic needs, food and non-food items, there will be mental health needs. You know, we are in 14 years of blockade. We've had the great marches of return. We've had COVID, and now this. Mental health needs are increasing, and we should not lose sight of that, including if there are thousands of people in shelters, there's bound to be gender-based violence, pressure on children. So we must also, from the beginning, think about and address the mental health of people and well-being.
Mr. Schmaler, thank you for taking time to talk with us today. That was Matthias Schmaler, Gaza director of the UN Relief and Works Agency, responsible for the welfare of Palestine refugees.
Thank you.
Within Israel, the conflict is fueling confrontations in some communities as mobs and Arabs and Jews confront each other on the streets. Simmering tensions in several mixed cities are boiling over into violence.
A brutal attack on the streets of Bat Yam. A group of far-right Israelis pull an Arab man out of his car and beat him. Mob attacks as well in the city of Lod. This surveillance footage shows Palestinian youths attacking an Orthodox Jew. Elsewhere, clashes erupted between Arabs and Israeli police. The violence is fueling fears that Israel could be headed for civil war. Jews and Arabs who live side by side in Israel's so-called mixed cities are deeply concerned. It was never like this, at this scale, never. There used to be small crimes, small fires. We need to live here together, coexistence. We need to be partners to each other. This Arab-owned ice cream store in Bat Yam was vandalized by a right-wing Jewish mob. Its owner says she was shocked by the violence. Most of my customers are Arabs or Jews. We've been mixed together this whole time. I never felt like there was something wrong. They used to come up and try to talk to me in Arabic. It was normal. I never felt anything wrong. Many in these towns are just hoping the unrest will end soon.
We are all Israelis. Arabs, Jews, we are Israelis. They are wonderful people. And it's just so heartbreaking what happened. And may it never happen again.
But an end to this conflict on Israel's streets appears a long way off. The Prime Minister has warned that violence is likely to increase in the coming days.
Well, tensions from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have spilled over to cities around the world, including here in Germany. There have been renewed protests against Israel's military operations in several German cities, with over 1,500 people gathering in the northern city of Bremen. And there have also been anti-Semitic incidents of vandalism targeting Jewish places of worship. Police arrested more than a dozen men suspected of damaging a synagogue in Bonn and starting a fire at a Jewish memorial site in Dusseldorf. Germany's Jewish community is calling for more protection at Jewish institutions.